In the Situation Room this morning, we're also joined by our guest host, Wanjiru Gikonyo. She's the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Accountability. Now, Wanjiru, your organization is among those that have gone to court because of what happened 2 weeks ago. This is a signing of a deal between the president, the national government, and the county government of the city of Nairobi. What's your beef?
Now, where do I start, Eric? We went to court because the manner in which the transfer was done is unprocedural, illegal, unconstitutional. And those are the issues we've placed before the court. And there's a hearing tomorrow. And we wait to see to get directions on that. And we're not the only ones. There are 3 petitions that have been filed on this. But the larger question for us is we are an institution that strongly supports devolution. And this is because we support the devolution of power. We believe that sustainable development is when development is for the people, by the people, including the people, is bottom up. And so we believe the way to redress inequality in this country, to distribute finances and resources equitably is through the devolution of power. We are aware that the national government, in this country, Kenya has a history of recentralization. The Independence Constitution was created devolved structures through the Majimbo government. That was rolled back, 1970s. The problems of centrism, of centralized governance had already begun to exhibit. And then the Kenyatta regime came up with a scheme to support the establishment of the growth of rural towns into larger municipalities. That system died. In the 80s, there was a district focus for rural development. And the reason for this was because people were flooding into Nairobi city looking for jobs because all the money was in Nairobi city. And there was no growth happening in an organized and supported way around. But the district focus for rural development also collapsed because the Moi government then that instituted this couldn't let go. In fact, the district focus for rural development put the provincial administration at the center. So when devolution came about, it came about in a context where the center has continually refused to let go. And what is it letting go of? Devolution is the transfer of authority, financial, political, administrative. That means you give local government powers to hire staff, to pass laws, pass budgets to implement those laws, and most importantly, local governments are to respond to citizens because they are closer to citizens. So, physical proximity may be, you may think it doesn't matter, but it does. Because if I'm looking for instance, I need to get a license. Previously, if I wanted to get a license, okay, I'd have gotten that from the local authority. Initially, there were fewer local authorities. But a license should be available not at the county office. It should be available at my ward office or my sub-county office. So services, it's a constitutional principle. Services should be proximate to citizens. So government should be sitting and saying, we're giving health services. At what level do we deliver these services? And then they need to set up the infrastructure to do that. So devolution should see increased accountability because you're involved in the budget process. You're therefore able to put forward your priorities, hold government accountable. You have representation from the county assembly level and the executive level. It should assist in terms of inclusion. So devolution is a big dream, and it's a very significant shift from centralized government. But the Jubilee administration in particular has been very uncomfortable with devolution. And of course, William Ruto, Uhuru Kenyatta voted against the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And then because of our political system, they were unfortunately put ascended to power to run the country under a constitution that they rejected, whose values and principles they possibly didn't fully take on board, and devolution is one of those. So my long, speech is to say that devolution is envisaged to bring development closer to the people and to be responsive to the people and accountable to the people. And the action of the president and Sonko flies in the face of that in letter and in spirit, and it must be resisted. And we've gone to court, and if the courts don't give us what we want, we are going to the citizens with a petition, because rights are, Martin Luther King said, rights must be claimed. They are not given. Power is never, those who enjoy power will never give it up voluntarily. Citizens must claim. So we have a constitution that gives us those rights. It's up to us to exercise those rights by claiming them.
If we're looking at, if we bypass the courts just for 1 minute and say that, all right, it gets to the point whereby this needs to be taken to the citizens, how are you assured of effective messaging? Because the messaging could go, but make sure that at the very level where they need to understand it and it needs to be tangible, how can you make sure that that messaging is actually effective and that you can measure success?
Ndu, I'm thinking I need to have a conversation with you because obviously, yes, we are policy people. We understand the policy. We consult with lawyers. We understand the law part of it, and we understand the rights. And we're able to craft petitions and go to court. When it goes to citizen messaging, we have to step it down, and we're in the process of doing that. Now, normally what we'll do, and what we're doing in this instance, is we're in discussion with residents' associations, because we have been working with certain residents' associations, sensitizing them around the law, because Nairobi County has passed very progressive legislation on public participation, which it then doesn't enforce because of the lack of political leadership. And in fact, the conversation we've been having with ourselves as residents is, what can residents do to improve the political leadership of the county? Because until we do that, the constitution will not serve us. And that's about really organizing around the electoral process to ensure that we get better outcomes and we're not subject to the tyranny of political parties that, are really giving us very poor. There's some good leaders at county assembly level, but then there are some that really don't deserve to be there. So we're working with residents' associations, and there's a number of networks that have also been working with informal settlements and various groups. So civil society we work on the ground, and we do have networks. What we haven't been able to do in Nairobi, and possibly what we should have tried to do, is to organize a county-wide kind of structure, but it's also very political, because at some point, particularly around the handshake, until things settled down, there was a very big sense, even amongst the citizens, that there were parts of the county that didn't want to engage in anything this government had to offer. So we're trying to do sensitization, come get involved in the budget process. They were like, we're not going to get involved there.
We don't know this government.
These are not our people. So the truth of the matter is we haven't invested enough. Civil society in this country, unfortunately, is like 90% donor dependent. Donors have, look at Nairobi and say Nairobi residents are much better off than residents of Marsabit or Turkana.
How are they better off exactly?
In terms of access to services, in terms of, in terms of access to services, just because they are the capital city. And so the emphasis of funding is in other counties, especially the marginalized counties, because there are counties that really don't know government. If the church, religious institutions hadn't been in some of those counties, there'd have been no services. And mortality rates are through the roof, education levels are really low. So you'll find some emphasis in informal settlements. You'll find emphasis in the marginalized counties. So devolution, in a very real sense, has not favored the big cities from a distribution of revenue. The division of revenue formula has actually meant that the big cities get less than they were getting before. But of course, big cities have potential to raise revenue, and because of failed political leadership, they haven't done that. So big cities, places like Kiambu, Nyeri, that previously had a lot of government expenditure, possibly have lost out under the devolved framework. But the mindset has to be, there's potential to raise revenue. There's also the trade-off. Devolution has given us stronger local assemblies, stronger citizen say.
Yeah.
Actually, devolution is supposed to be rests on public participation. Not even public participation, it's citizen engagement. Self-governance is the term that the Constitution uses.
Do you find that citizens are, when you get to the nitty-gritty of it, that citizens are really interested in the basics that they need as opposed to the following of the leader of the day?
I'd say yes, they are. And if we had wider spread, more sustained programs, we would see that. But yes, they are. My personal experience is where we've worked with residents' associations, organized groups. Once they understand the framework, understand their roles, responsibilities, and the opportunities, they engage and they will demand. Now, where that kind of gets lost is if the government doesn't respond the first time, second time, third time, and we don't sustain the engagement, maybe escalate it, go to court, do the next action, then those residents may decide, okay, we engaged, it didn't work. And so, some apathy can set in.
Yep.
But we've also seen instances where we've done sensitization and groups organize themselves and begin to engage. There's one youth group in Embakasi. We were doing a solid waste program. We're doing sensitization around the budget, employment of youth in solid waste and all of that. And they were so moved by the issue, they organized themselves and actually started, they had been doing some kind of unstructured work around solid waste, and they got much more structured. And once you register yourself, you have legal status, you're then able to begin borrowing money, and they began problem solving. We also did another program around funds, because there's lots of funds made available, youth development funds. And another group, in a different part of Nairobi, also registered and then were able to register themselves and actually register as a CBO and begin sensitizing. So knowledge is empowering. And the one thing I find is when citizens have knowledge and understand the opportunities, they themselves take the initiative. But the reality is the responsiveness of government or the non-responsiveness of government is a big problem. And so, pushing government to unlock. So I think citizens put in a lot more effort than the responsiveness
they receive.
That they receive. So we do have a problem. But I think, when you're in this situation, we have to recognize we are trying to democratize a system that is a closed system that is benefiting a few.
It requires us to push. Let's take a short break,
Exactly.
Wanjiru, and then at 17 minutes past 7, take a look at the weather, and then we continue the conversation. Wanjiru Gikonyo is our guest host this morning. She's from the Institute for Social Accountability, and she's saying citizens deserve a say before any county functions are transferred from the county government to the national government. We're talking about a petition that has been filed, one of petitions that have been filed by civil society organizations and citizens concerning the decision to transfer some functions from the county government of Nairobi to the national government. And that's what we're actually looking at just before we went to the break. That's what we're discussing this hour. I hear this petition and to me it resonates. Because I feel that, when it comes to issues of transferring of functions or anything that goes into tinkering with the state of devolution, then the people need to be involved. The citizens need to be involved. The citizens need to make that decision themselves that, yes, our government, because of one reason or the other, you don't have the functions right now. Let's transfer this function to somebody else, but also determine for how long. What are we going to be doing in the interim? How shall these functions come back to us? And then how do we hold our government accountable at both levels?
Eric, would you consider the BBI rallies to be public participation?
The BBI rallies? No, they are rallies.
So where is the public participation in this entire BBI process?
The public participation is only, I think, when it goes to going to the task force, the steering committee.
Yes, and how much of public participation is it really?
We're in the steering committee.
Yes.
It's open to the public. Any member of the public is open to go and do it. Now, the thing is, of course, I would support a better organized participation, in which case we're saying that the steering committee is going around the counties and announcing that we're going to be holding a town hall and this is it. So, engage more with the people, not saying bring in memoranda. But of course, timelines and all would be the argument that is used here.
Oh, there's always time. If it's something that the government considers important, they will make time for it. Let me explain what I mean by why I'm asking. Let me explain why I'm asking the question.
Yes.
We talk about public participation. By the time you get to the point where you are dealing with a rally or the so-called committee meeting, there ought to have been other meetings within that particular area where they have discussed. So when people come to this huge forum in the town hall, there is some understanding that people have arrived at, and even those views are representative. Because the truth is, not every view can be collated or collected on that day. It's just the truth.
True.
Now, do we see, sense, understand that such a process has actually taken place?
Where?
My question, City, is why are you linking BBI to the re-centralization of Nairobi?
No.
Or are you?
It's public participation that I am focusing on, which is the bedrock of this decision-making process.
Right, but you see...
And I'm saying that if we understand what I'm asking, then it is clear that public participation did not take place in this decision that was made between the County of Nairobi and the national government.
Yeah, but you see, the BBI is an inherently political process. We actually don't know. We are now beginning to see how it works. In essence, handshake, 9 questions are floated. A number of people are consulted. Some report is generated that really is very incoherent, doesn't make sense. And then those provisions begin getting implemented.
It would be perfect.
This is what's happening.
It would be perfect if they did not attempt to tell us that those town hall meetings are supposed to represent public participation.
But
this is what I'm getting at.
And I think you agree with Latif then when you say BBI is a political process. Those are political rallies.
And even if it's a political process, it has to align its processes to the Constitution. What
True.
I'm trying to say is that this thing should be understood for what it actually is, as opposed to what is being fobbed onto us that it is.
And in fact, when you say this thing should be understood, the transfer of functions should be understood for what it is. It's a re-centralization.
It's a power grab.
It's a power grab. In fact, that's the perfect word. Functions can be transferred. This is subject to court interpretation. The conditions for transfer, I think Wanyama, Advocate Wanyama, spoke to this, where he was saying it's anticipated that it would be transferred on 2 grounds: subsidiarity or capacity. Subsidiarity being where national government may decide public schools, public primary schools are better run by the county because they are closer. They can set up PTAs more effectively. They can monitor and all of that.
Yep.
So subsidiarity is saying this service is better implemented at the lowest level. So let's transfer it. It can also be transferred on the basis of capacity. You go into a county and they don't have maybe the personnel, they don't have the infrastructure. And so that service is maybe transferred back, but there's a catch. Because national government is also supposed to build capacity. So it can't... One
should be temporary.
It should be temporary.
Time bound.
One example, I remember one argument around vaccines, because vaccines had been procured centrally and then stored centrally because of the cost, economies of scale of how they are procured. So there was a very strong argument being made by some factions of the medical profession that vaccine procurement should not be decentralized to county level. It doesn't make economic sense. So those are the kind of questions that are supposed to happen. In the case of Nairobi, the problem we have is not that the county doesn't have capacity. It's that the county has been mismanaged by the
elected political leader.
Subsequent. I mean, Kidero did his bit, but of course under Sonko, it's totally fallen apart because he doesn't even have the CEC. He doesn't have a cabinet. He doesn't make cabinet decisions. So there is no political basis on which decisions are being made. So the option would have been they could have gotten into an agreement because the Intergovernmental Relations Act allows national government and the county government to set up, to sign an agreement to manage functions. You don't have to transfer them. But, ironically, from 2013, 2014, there's been a Nairobi regeneration program running. And in the interest of disclosure, I sit on the Nairobi County Budget and Economic Forum, and so we've been quite involved with the county governance in the budget process. And there's been a regeneration program running, which has national government officers and county government officers sitting to implement county functions. Now, we raised concerns about regeneration because it was very opaque. And we asked, why doesn't this regeneration get, make it clear what
you're doing?
What is national government putting in financially? What is county putting in financially? And who is responsible? And then they'd keep saying, well, no, it's just an intergovernmental dialogue coordination framework, and the county officers continue to implement. So what they could have done is taken that regeneration program and made it, legislated it. This Gazette notice should have been on that. It's not a transfer, because they are proposing to transfer staff from county back to national. So that means the county has the capacity. They're lacking political leadership. So one, they could have done an agreement under the Intergovernmental Relations Act. They didn't have to transfer the functions. The second thing is the county revenues have been falling. And in fact, you noticed KRA has already been gazetted to begin collecting revenues. This was there was no public participation once that Gazette notice was published. The government has begun implementing.
When do the 14 days lapse?
Thank you.
Because they
haven't lapsed yet.
The deed of agreement says that everything comes into effect after 14 days. And within those 14 days, we're going to have, alerting the National Assembly, alerting the County Assembly, and public participation.
Public participation.
This is public
you
participation.
noticed yesterday.
It didn't envisage court cases.
I think yesterday, or it might have even been Friday, KRA put the notice that it's beginning to collect revenues from the county. So this means that this was not a process that was open for discussion. This was
But can I ask the question,
foregone.
when it comes to revenue, is it that the mechanism for collecting revenue is faulty, or is it that the revenue that is collected never gets to where it actually should?
With revenue, the latter is the case, and this is a political accountability question. Revenues in Nairobi, under Kidero, went up 2013, 14, 15, 16, and then started declining again. So when Kidero came in, and under pressure to perform and run things properly, the revenues were going up. And then at some point, I think political interests set in, and the emphasis on accountability went down, and the revenues began to fall. And then, of course, they collapsed around 2017, 2018 because of the dispute over the elections. And when they came up, they never went back up to the
same level.
To the same level. So it is very clear. And in fact, we did a memorandum to Sakaja, to the County Assembly, to the Controller of Budget around this question, because we said, where is the money going? Are you saying Kenyans have stopped paying their licensing fees? How can revenue fall? It was obvious that the money was being...
It was about accountability.
It was about accountability. So now the
I think
public
stolen
finance...
is the word you're looking for.
Stolen.
Right, okay.
Stolen. Yeah, thank you.
But the question
Public
I would
Finance
ask...
Management Act allows the CS, Treasury, to step in to a county where financial management is deemed. So one, the national government could have intervened on that very thing. And actually, there's a mechanism where funds are stopped to that county until those issues are resolved.
I have heard you say a couple of times, could have, should have, but obviously these are things that did not happen. So then, could you point then that towards an absence of willingness to have this done? Because
Obviously.
you said we could have had the conversation. It could have been a different way. We should have done it this way. But I mean, obviously, we're at a place where it's already been gazetted. KRA is already collecting funds.
It's not a fait accompli. We must fight back because it's totally illegal. Like I said, we are under de facto benevolent dictatorship. It's benevolent because we are not being coerced through intimidation in our daily lives. But it is a coup against the Constitution of Kenya, and it is a suspension of our rights.
Wanjiru, we are being coerced. In fact, we are being violated every single day We've been plummeted so much so we don't
Not
even...
just on matters
we-
Nairobi.
We don't even seem to understand when we're being violated. We actually seem to have gotten to a point where we think it's normal. And it isn't.
I say
Okay,
benevolence
okay. The
because
sun is rising. It's going to be a bright
It's
day.
not actually.
We are talking about devolution in this country and the actions that we saw between the county government of Nairobi and the national government, transfer of some 4 functions to the national government. Of course, some civil society organizations and citizens have gone to court challenging this. There are already conversations around this. Wanjiru Gikonyo is raising this morning as an issue for us to discuss. And I'm saying, all right, yes, so it makes a lot of sense when we say that citizens should be involved in making such major decisions. But also, let's look back at citizens and the citizen engagement, not even participation, but engagement. When you say that looking just casually at what has happened in Nairobi, it's an issue of governance and failure of governance, where were the citizens during all this time? Do we feel that the citizens engaged during this time? And I feel that citizens haven't engaged. And also because...
How can they engage, Eric?
Those are the questions. When we say that the devolution is about people governing themselves, people seem to forget that they have a role and a duty.
They do. When I say we've been violated, that's precisely what I mean. When you've been plummeted to the point where you think that being violated is normal, you really have a problem. What is the self-preservation mechanisms that Kenyans employ? Silence. And you assume it is compliance, and it isn't necessarily compliance. It's just that you feel this is the best way to self-preserve.
True.
Because anything to the contrary would put you in harm's way by simply bringing yourself to the fore.
True.
It's why people keep quiet.
But I think we are starting from the point of silence. I'm not saying a point where we started from a point of engagement and then we got plummeted and then we got silent.
Oh, by the way, I'm actually with you on this one here. I actually want to introduce my own agenda here. This is why I'm going the route I'm going.
Okay.
You see, whenever we talk of finances, the thing that isn't talked about is the reality of the actual possibility and probabilities of that particular amount. Do we know what the Nairobi County is actually able to generate in terms of revenues? We don't. So whenever somebody throws 14 billion at you, you say it's a huge amount. A huge amount compared to what? What is the
Against what
capacity?
capacity?
Yes. What is the capacity of the county? When you know that, then those amounts will make sense.
Coming from a point of engagement or silence, I think also leaders understand very well that Kenyans generally are not going to speak up. That Kenyans generally will take that information or the lack of information and really keep quiet and not do anything with it. And I think that they have used that to their advantage quite broadly, across. If you want to look at other countries where you see this kind of participation, it's because the leaders are very well aware that citizens will make noise, will not agree to this kind of thing.
But it begins from citizens engaging.
Right, but you see, if people are not inclined towards that engagement from the very beginning, that's where you also have a problem. And you will find that leaders will prey on this because they understand that the people will actually not raise arms or will not get out and protest.
To some extent, I will not blame the leaders for that. Because the system as it is, of course, the government as it is, it's going to ensure that it runs the way it's best running. The citizens should ensure that they engage so that the government runs the way.
It helps the agenda when they know that nobody's going to speak up.
This is where civil society comes in because they play the role of the citizen's voice. At least they stand up on behalf. They do stand up. And if you if you look at the venom with which the government tends to direct energies at civil society, it tells you civil society is effective. Something that isn't working or isn't a thorn in your flesh, you'd simply ignore. But it also tells you that those in power would rather the citizenry had no voice.
Absolutely.
I think and I agree, maybe what I'd wish to qualify is citizens do engage. Like I told you, we lobbied quite strongly with the County of Nairobi, had the County Budget Economic Forum set up. We were... I sit on that, but we also supported the forum. And through this forum, we were able to engage with various groups, professional groups and everybody around the budget process. And so we tracked very closely under the Kidero administration for the first 4 years. And what we found is, as soon as the budget process started, there was very wide engagement by citizens. Citizens really attended, especially in informal settlements where people rely on public services. They really attended.
But they were organized to attend.
No. let
They didn't do this of their own volition.
No.
I think is where CT is going.
They were
with this.
invited, but they
They
chose
were
to attend.
invited.
No, the county put out announcements and citizens showed up. There were town halls around the budget process. This is what happens.
But
And
I
they're
think
not-
where CT is
hold on.
coming from is that in the
Allow me
initial
to
point
finish.
of it,
Allow
people
me-
didn't rise up and say,
Allow me-
didn't rise up and say, I want to be involved in this process. An
allow
invitation
me-
took place.
Allow me to finish, because the point I'm making is citizens responded to there are various forms of participation. You've got invited participation, you've got uninvited participation. Invited participation is where government invites you into its processes. And, public participation is not just to attend the meeting. There are various, you get involved in decision making, you get involved in oversight, you get involved in co-implementation, because there are parts of this country where where resident associations are implementing public services because they partnered with the county government. So there are various forms of participation, and there are structured invited spaces, whether they are committees like the County Budget Economic Forum, health committees, and their budget meetings. Now, the rationale behind the budget meetings is, one, citizens will show up, give their priorities, county government will document those priorities and will then aggregate those priorities so that as it implements its county integrated development plan and annual budgets, it's responding to those priorities. That's the thinking.
How do people know about this?
The problem comes in. It's not that citizens don't engage in invited and uninvited, because citizens also organize themselves as residents associations and engage with county. The problem is that there's an assumption of rule of law and responsiveness on the part of government officers. And this has, the challenge with public participation has been citizens show up, they engage, they give their demands, they then expect a response, they don't get it. Why don't they get it? One, maybe the county doesn't have enough resources, so it's prioritizing some other things. Number two, the public participation process is dysfunctional. 3, political will. 4, corruption. So because of all these factors, our public participation process is not responsive. In Nairobi, it's been particularly bad, and what happened is by the 3rd year, citizens had figured out, we are going for these meetings, we are giving submissions, they're not getting taken up. So in about 21, the figure may be slightly lower, citizens showed up and blasted government and said, we are not giving you our priorities because you didn't implement last year.
Yeah.
Right? So the point is, as we sit here, we have to recognize the Constitution anticipated rule of law, and it anticipated government would make efforts to comply with the law.
But did
right?
they?
But they didn't. So the problem we're having actually is not our legal system, it's our political system. And the question we need to ask is, how do we enable citizens to influence a government that can violate the Constitution and ignore a court directive, because that's what's happening. You've had...
I think citizens should come from that default position.
Yeah.
That because, yes, because you're coming from, you're changing the way we've been governed for the longest, then you should assume that this government is not going to be responsive. Come from that default position. But then the citizens themselves need to be aware. Like all those things that you're saying, yes, citizens engage, citizens are invited, they engage. But what percentage of Nairobi voters, for instance, is aware of all these things?
And this is where I wanted to go with this. If I can just ask,
somebody took
Wanjiru,
a default
if
position.
I can just ask so that you can combine this answer with what you're saying. Because what Eric is saying is extremely important here. Because there could be a small percentage of people who are engaging, but development begets development. If people are not aware that people are engaged, if people are aware that others are engaging at whatever level, it gives them impetus to actually be engaged in the future, which is why we're asking at this point, who is aware of this participation? Some of it we're hearing for the first time today.
No, I'll tell you something, and be very careful when you talk about awareness about public participation processes, because the professional middle class, upper class are actually the least aware because they don't rely on government services. At the local level, people are aware because they rely on public services. Now, the problem is, of course, the notices for public participation usually are put up just a few days before. But there has been awareness, and there is participation, by the way, and there are records of it. And it's not perfect, but it's there. So one, we need more civic education. We need better, the last 2 years, under Sonko, ironically, the process for budgeting was actually becoming more deliberative because of the role of civil society actors working with the county, and the budget office had accepted. We are getting into meetings and people are shouting us down and threatening us. Can it be more deliberative? So they were actually saying, okay, we'll review. This is what we did. And this is why we did up to there. Because, so it was improving because these officers have been doing public participation all this time and they are learning and they are listening.
Yeah.
But political leadership. So, and the political leadership is the governor and also the county assembly members. The other problem we've had with public participation is that MCAs view the public as their territory. So the County Government Act anticipates that the ward administrator will be the point of public participation at the ward level. And this should actually even go to the village. And this person is required.
The ward administrator is from the executive
arm. So there's an executive arm created, governor, sub-county administrator, ward administrator to the village. Mm-hmm. And these people are supposed to do public participation on government policies, government budget, response to service delivery
issues. And they know
all
this.
Yes, they do, by the way. For us, we engage with our ward administrator. Now, the problem comes in two things. MCAs don't like to hear that there's
somebody
a ward
else is engaging with the
because
public. Yeah.
MCAs only see votes.
Yeah.
And they're like, now, if this person can solve that problem, what will I do? So we have had actually a very, very big tug of war on public participation because of MCAs. And it's a mindset issue.
And are they involved in these processes when you have them?
In Makueni, they've been not the first time, but they've been able to integrate them into their public participation process.
And the problems that you raised, do they still exist once they've been incorporated?
Of course, they exist because of our political culture, but they're mitigated. By the way, there is no perfect scenario. What you can do is militate. You
mitigate.
You mitigate, and you allow. It's not going to be perfect because we're building a culture of democracy where there was none. And citizens themselves, when they engage with MCAs, are handouts mentality.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dysfunction. The point is, there has been a lot of public participation going on. The productiveness, the quality could be below par. In some areas, it's actually tokenistic. Because you'll have some.
Wait, did I hear you say that the bribery process that we have among politicians amounts to dysfunctionalism?
Sorry?
The bribes, when you talk about MCAs and the tokenism where people come knowing they may be given something, you mentioned that it sort of like indicates a form of dysfunction. And I'm asking, is it actually dysfunctional?
No. We're talking about public participation.
Yes.
And the efforts to, and the fact that there has been public participation, there have been some results, some good results in some of the counties. Nairobi County, there's been some results. For instance, healthcare workers were able to agitate and have their allowances increased because they organized themselves around this issue. When we reviewed the budget sometime in 2016, we found that the national government was actually responding to citizen priorities. But when it came to actual expenditure, they weren't spending on what citizens wanted. So, for instance, citizens came and said, we have a problem with solid waste. It's a big issue. The county said, solid waste. We have to do this, do that. But instead of giving citizens what they asked for, they then went and procured trucks.
Yep.
So the catch is this. So what do we say? There's technical processes have been set up for public participation that presume a political leadership that's aligned ideologically. And that is not working.
But I'm saying,
and I was looking at the Swiss example, because of course we're going to be hosting the Swiss ambassador. And I was like, now this is where we got it wrong. Because we put public participation almost as an optional. It's a value and a principle in the Constitution. But when you look at the force, the ability for citizens to require government or force government to take up their proposals, it's not there. Because the final buck lands and ends with the politicians. For instance,
Pause.
in the
Pause.
Swiss example,
Okay,
Swiss
pause.
example,
Because I can see
Swiss
City wanting
example.
to jump in.
Yeah.
Swiss example,
Yes.
Swiss example, they
That's a
don't
bubble after
have
the
a
break.
constitutional court. When there are constitutional matters of interest, the final say is with the citizens. Bang. Then they have a culture of bottom-up sovereignty, so that they've taken what we are calling public participation to a bottom-up sovereignty where the lower level of government is very empowered and the voice of the citizen is equally very empowered. So what we need to do is to go back and
that's where the
see
pause is, so
how-
that you can come in and say what we need to do. Our guest host this morning, Wanjiru Gikonyo, is citizen participation and citizen engagement, and ensuring that citizens are the ones that make the decision. This is what is envisaged in the Constitution. This is not what is being practiced on a daily basis, of course, by both levels of government, at the county level, at the national level. And, well, they sort of back and forth that we've been having in the last 15 minutes has been, are citizens aware of their duties and responsibilities? Are the elected leaders aware of their duties and responsibilities? Of course, you've told us what has been happening so far in terms of setting up those structures, and you're saying that the structures have been set up, a lot has been done to set up the structures. Are citizens aware of those structures and responsibilities? Because I want to still go back there. Yes, citizens may come and participate. Citizens may engage. Citizens may feel that they engage on certain levels, say in budget making process. But on the political decisions, are they engaging?
Yes, citizens are engaging, and studies show that there's more public participation than ever before, and in fact the levels are pretty high. But the ability of those citizens to influence the outcomes of whichever process, that's where the problem comes in. And so, of course, apathy and disaffection will set in. And the point I was making is that the problem we have is, in Kenya, we have a devolved system of government, and that word devolution is not used in many country contexts, because most countries will go for a federal system where they give really the political power to the lower level of government,
To the devolved...
to the devolved level of government. But in Kenya, because we are unitary, we are coming from a highly centralized state, the politicians would not have that total transfer of power, so we went for a devolved system. This devolved system, actually, we've realized now, in many ways is muting the political power of the devolved level of government and of the citizen. And my view is, rather than re-centralize, as the president is trying to do in Nairobi, and like I said, citizens must resist because it's totally unconstitutional and illegal, rather than re-centralize, we need more devolution. We need to decentralize services to the lowest level possible. But if we were to talk about constitutional referendum, there are a number of things that would need to happen. And, borrowing on the Swiss example.
This one, I have to chime in here.
But I haven't finished.
I-
City,
I
allow
actually
me.
don't want you to
I'll try and be
finish.
quick. I'll try and be quick. I'll try and be quick.
Yes.
I'll try and be
He wants to
quick.
interrupt.
Number one.
Yes, that's the whole point.
Number one,
I
no,
want to
I'm not
interrupt
letting
her
you interrupt,
conversation.
because I liked the fact that the Swiss don't have a constitutional court. The final say is with the citizens, and the citizens then become the final defender of the constitution. Referenda are then not subjected to parliamentary approval as we have in Kenya. So that when citizens say we are fed up and we want a referendum question, that referendum will be determined by the outcome of that referendum. The last point is that there's a balance between, they have a bicameral house like Kenya has, but there's a balance of power between the upper and the lower house. In Kenya's situation, the National Assembly, the Constitution anticipates that they are equal, doesn't quite say, but in actual fact, the National Assembly has more power. So there's a need to balance the powers between the houses of Parliament. So if there was any constitutional amendments that actually, these are the constitutional amendments that are needed. And as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, in line with civic engagement, civic governance, this is something that we will need to pursue, because otherwise we are playing in a political field that is rigged against citizen interests and against the interests of the sovereignty of people, self-determination of the people.
So it is a fait accompli in this case.
It is a fait accompli. The transfer process is a fait.
City,
it's an
interrupt.
attempted fait accompli,
Go ahead, City.
but we will resist.
I'm cheering you.
You are aware that Wanjiru is sitting next to me, and she has weapons of mass destruction next to her. I don't want any of those flying in my direction. I'm referring to the biro. You see, everything we're saying here points to something very straightforward, and that is the democratic process that this country is going through in understanding where and how it ought to deal with its issues, specifically this one that we keep referring to as the bringing down and ensuring that services are available at the most basic of levels. The country that Wanjiru keeps referring to, Switzerland, is as old as time itself. And for the longest time, they've had their time to go through their processes. They didn't start the way they are now. No, they went through many processes before they got to a place where they found a working formula. And I'm saying we are working through this process. And I would argue we are doing it very quickly. Because if you're talking about public participation, and we are in 2020, and we are talking about the multi-partyism coming in what, 1992, 1997?
That's true.
We've moved fast. If we're talking about in 2010 having a new constitution, and we're talking about this new constitution, and we look at how robust the constitution is, 10 years down the line, we have made significant progress. Everything we're doing is important because it's part of that process of arriving at a point where we understand what and how this thing works for us as Kenyans. And the civil society has done an excellent job in ensuring that this process is moved forward. And this issue of public participation, please understand, participation doesn't mean attending a meeting. Not attending is also participation. It's like...
But being aware is the bigger participation.
That is probably it. And how it is clearly understood that the message doesn't have to resonate with the person who's delivering it, but how it will impact on the person who's receiving it.
I think it's also very important then for being aware, understanding that you as a citizen actually do have a role to play and can agitate for change. A lot of people are not speaking up, or a lot of people are not participating because they are not aware that they can, or that their voice or that their action leads to some
or
kind
they're
of change,
afraid
or that
to
you have a duty.
participate actively.
Because you're not sure what is going to come if you do. And
Going
I think
back
that
to
is
our
very
history,
important to look at.
participation could lead to incarceration. So you are not going to take a risk of sticking your neck out to be the person who's speaking loudly.
Which is why I'm throwing the barb back at the civil society. I know you've given them a very wild rose and it's a beautiful one, but the barb here is civil society has a role of ensuring that the public is aware.
If you want me to speak loudly on this matter, Eric, let me sit when Du is speaking, when I'm far away from Wanjiru.
I know Wanjiru is going to say this is the job of the government. This is the job of the government. But remember what we said? We are starting from that point where the government, let's assume
they're not doing
that the government is not going to take up this responsibility. Who else should? Civil society has a very, very critical role in ensuring that people know, so that we can now put the government to account and say, government, now from this point on, we want to be aware about everything that's happening.
I think, Eric, based on that premise, I would say civil society's role is to protect the Constitution and to fight against the clawback of the rights, because we're having a very serious reversal, not only of the constitutional dispensation, but of our democratic process. So our role as civil society is not to step in and do what government's supposed to do. We can't. Government runs, you're talking about 43 million Kenyans and, like a 3 trillion
47.
47.
Almost 48, right?
Right. 4 million.
Yeah, okay. I'm not trying to rig them out. They're participating. Yeah, right. So you're talking about, civil society is quite small, quite thinly resourced. So what can we do? Our role is to protect the implementation of the Constitution.
Okay, just to leave it there. So we'll have the conversation on the role of the civil society. We're coming to the top of the hour. City Muga, remind us. Proverb of the day.
The proverb of the day refers to a little animal that we are all familiar with called the lizard. The lizard lies on their belly, but we cannot tell whether it has a belly ache. Figure that one out.
We will. Indeed.